So let's see. The other side, so I can see myself a little bit. Okay, Seth is asking when the quiz will be next week. It will be on Tuesday, and then I'll just leave it open for the full 24 hours, so from morning to midnight, and you'll have 3 hours to take it, but you can take it whenever you want during that day. It's online, so I'm not going to limit it to like our little chunk of time. Seems kind of pointless. I'm going to wait a couple minutes, let any stragglers show up before I start. Any other questions that you guys have, by the way, while we're waiting? Final papers were due yesterday. The Kahoot will be posted on Thursday. Everyone did pretty good on the rough draft. I gave them all my comments. Yeah, so the grades should be pretty good on the rough draft. At the end of the day, no one's going to get anything like terrible. And then I will post the, I'll just keep you guys updated on how the grades are going in. It's not going to be longer, the quiz at least. The quiz won't be longer, but you'll have 3 hours to take it instead of like an hour and a half like we normally do. It's not going to take that long. I'm not going to make it any different than any of the other quizzes we've had, so it shouldn't take you the whole time. It will be available for the whole 24-hour period on Tuesday, though. It is open book, yeah, because it's online. I can't reasonably expect you guys to, like, how am I supposed to regulate that? So yes, it's open book, open note. You can use, the slides or whatever you want to use. Just do the best you can. Next Tuesday, yes. And yes, you get 3 hours. It's not going to take that long, or it shouldn't. It's not designed to. It's designed to fit in like a regular class time, but you will have 3 hours to take it if you want. So, yeah. Seems like all the questions are pretty much that again. Yeah. So it'll open up, like 12:01 in the morning and close at midnight. So just make sure you're done with it by midnight. Icon doesn't like it when you're trying to take the quiz when the timer ends. So it might kick you out or something might glitch out if you do that. So just make sure that you finish the quiz by midnight. That's really the only restriction that you have on it. But yeah, you're free to use any notes or any, the slides or whatever. It just means that I'm less likely to, quote directly from these or, it'll be more applied, kind of like the last quiz where there were some that were more like from the readings that you guys had, or that was a little bit more conceptual and not something that's strictly from these slides. It's on Tuesday. Yeah. And then you'll get those grades back pretty much instantaneously. I'll probably have some short answer ones and I'll have to grade those myself, but you'll at least get all of the, the multiple choice or the matching or whatever done pretty quickly. So the only grades that you guys that you don't have right now are the final paper, the draft, and the peer review thing, and this last quiz and participation. So if you have been participating, then I think you have a good idea of, what your participation is. I'm going to go really light on it because I know it's been a difficult transition and it's, odd to go from in-person to, so unless you've been completely silent through both halves of this class, expect to get a pretty good grade on your participation. And then I will get the draft and the final paper grades up as soon as I can. I don't want to give a hard date on that because I honestly don't know right now. Your final quiz is on Tuesday. You'll get instantaneous grades on most of those, and I'll probably get the rest of the grades in by the day after that, for the quiz at least. So I'll have the rest of that week to work on grading your final papers and at least entering in my grades for your drafts, because you kind of saw, at least in my comments, if I thought that you kind of were missing things. So yeah, yes. Oh, and the reflections, you're right. The reflections, I did forget about those, and the reflections. You need to have 2 reflections done by, no, you were right, I forgot those. I did post the reflection for the migration week, so that one's up. I'll try and get the reflection prompt for this week up before Sunday, just so you guys have some more time to work on it if you want to. But you guys have seen how I've been grading those two. It's pretty much as long as you're talking about the thing I'm asking you about and that you have submitted the reflection, you will get full credit. So that one's also not, it's a self-reflection. I can't grade you on correctness if it's, your opinion or your meditations on the class, as long as you're actually thinking about the class I'm telling you to think about. Oh yeah, this Thursday, that's right, because I've moved stuff around. Okay. I will post the reflection today, then the prompt for this week. You're right, I have moved some stuff around, so that one escaped me. I'll post the reflection prompt for this week tonight, and then you'll have, yes, I see you guys. Yes, the 2 reflections are due by Thursday because things got moved around. So I will post the prompt tonight. The prompt for migration is already up from last week. So that will be all the prompts you'll have to pull from. Have the 2 be over topics that we discussed after spring break up to this week. And you should be good. Yes. All right. Cool. Okay, you guys keep me on my toes. I love this. This is perfect. Like the dates all get muddled in my head after a while when I'm changing things around. You keep me honest. I love it. Okay. We good? I'm seeing a Gucci gang in the chat, which makes me feel old, but sounds like we're good. Okay. All right, so then this week we're talking about embassies, and I always put like a little admin slide anyway, so I'll make sure that I haven't missed anything in our little chat. Yeah, make sure you turned in your final papers. They were due yesterday. I hope you turned them in, but if you haven't, you need them in. We're almost done. This is our last lecture for the semester. You guys have been amazing, and I really love this. I hope you guys have had a good time. I want to say thank you to you guys for being such a great class, especially in, the apocalypse. You've been fantastic. You've made this transition really smooth for me. I hope I've been able to make it pretty smooth for you guys. And I just want to say thank you. You've been a good class. So I hope you had a good time. Final exam, Tuesday the 12th, midnight to midnight. So 12:01 in the morning on Tuesday to 11:59 p.m. on that night. It will be open. You'll have 3 hours of available time for you to take it. It really shouldn't take that long. I'm going to design it to be like a regular quiz you would have taken in class. Just make sure you finish by midnight. And then I'll post the Kahoot on Thursday as well. So you'll have your 2 reflections due on Thursday. The Kahoot will be uploaded. If for any reason if you're not participating on this live stream, just send me a screenshot of you participating in the Kahoot, just taking the Kahoot. You only have to do 1 to get participation points for this week, though. I mean, everyone's welcome to take the Kahoot, though. Okay. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so when we first started this class, I kind of asked you guys what you were interested in looking at, and the one that was most strongly related to national security, that was something I hadn't built into the class already, was this discussion of embassy security. This was near-ish that time where there were protests in Iraq around a lot of the US embassies, and there were a lot of security questions on that. So I can see why it became important. And I think it's a different way to look at some of the stuff we've talked about in class already, while also adding something new. So we've talked a lot about military bases, about keeping citizens safe abroad, about how different departments in the government have different assigned tasks that they're supposed to be doing, and kind of how those departments have changed over time, right? So all of those things actually connect pretty well to how embassies have changed over time and what embassies are supposed to do. So it actually fits pretty well. So we're going to talk about that. So first off, some like basic terms. What's an embassy? An embassy is essentially just a headquarters for the US government abroad. So it's not like a military base where you have military forces stationed anywhere. We're not like occupying a country. All it is the representative of our government in another country. And most of the time what they're trying to do is really just keep citizens of the US who are maybe traveling or who are just present in that country safe, or let them have a place where they can talk with their government. An ambassador is the person that leads the embassy, and they essentially represent the president abroad. Embassies are usually located in the capital of whichever country they're residing in. And then you have branch offices or smaller regional offices called consulates scattered around the country as well. The embassy and the consulate itself actually belong to the country it represents. So it's not, so if you have a US consulate in Iran, that consulate belongs to the United States. It's not actually, belonging to Iran still. Katie is asking, is ransomware a big threat to an embassy? Do they focus a lot on this or no? From what I've seen historically, no, there's not a lot of talk about like cybersecurity when we're looking at embassies. I'm sure it's probably just as much of an issue as it is for like an average US state when it's trying to protect its own, like digital presence. There's a little bit of like espionage concerns with embassies. So not necessarily cybersecurity, but a concern about like bugs and other listening devices that have been planted in it. I wouldn't call that cybersecurity, but it's like the closest to what I've seen historically discussed when we're looking at embassies. Haley is asking, are ambassadors appointed by the president? Essentially, yes, they are. They work for the Foreign Service, and there's different ways that a person can gain their credentials or the ability to be an ambassador, and one of them is to be appointed by the president. Yeah, so the president can decide that they want you to represent them in a specific country. There's another way that you can become an ambassador, which is to take essentially like a test that the Foreign Service has designed, which, I mean, if you're interested in it, that is an avenue you can go into when you're taking like a more IR leaning political science degree. It's a really strenuous test. So you essentially are working for the Foreign Service, which is like a subsidiary of the State Department. And it is a year-long test. And then once you take that year-long test, there's like one other final exam you take. And at that point, you would be considered, like able to become an ambassador. It's a really long process, but it's very prestigious. I mean, that's a title you hold for pretty much your whole life once you get it. Like people recognize that that's what you are. And it can, open up this kind of a job to you. Or you can just donate a crap ton of money to a presidential campaign, and that's another way that you can become an ambassador. But then the question of, credentials kind of comes up, and at least if you're taking that test and you have those credentials, there's a lot of like weird variation in who becomes an ambassador because there are so many different avenues that you can use to become one. Yeah, Ambassador McMullen, he teaches here, so he used to be an ambassador, but we still call him that. He's still recognized as an ambassador. It's definitely a very prestigious position to have. Yes, but you would need to work your way up through the Foreign Service Department. You're right, Hannah. Badri is asking who they report to directly. And then Hannah is discussing more about, Ambassador McMullen's process. Yeah. So technically they are appointed by the president. So I'm assuming that they're in some way reporting to the president, Badri, but there are goals that each consulate or each embassy is trying to achieve within the country that it is in. So they want to achieve those goals, and those are usually laid out by the State Department. Right here, actually. So that last point on this slide, the purpose of an embassy is to assist American citizens who travel or live abroad, but also to encourage cultural exchange and understanding between the United States and whatever country it's in. So you want to make, if they're in the United Kingdom, you want to make people that live there more comfortable with the U.S., more familiar with how the U.S. kind of works, how the government works, what U.S. culture is, and kind of create a more positive relationship between the two, right? And that's kind of why we see this is the U.S.'s embassy in the United Kingdom, and then Italy's embassy in Brazil at the bottom. That's why these buildings usually are really pretty. They're really fancy. They're usually like big architectural kind of works. They're located in the capitals, these big ones are, and they're usually just gorgeous. And it's because that's how our country is represented abroad. So people don't get to go to the US to see us. They can see, though, this building. And the better this building looks, the better our country is perceived, right? So even as like a kind of soft power influence, we try to use these buildings to influence how other countries view us. Yeah, okay. Cool. So let's continue our discussion. So who secures these embassies though? That's kind of where this national security, well, it's already a national security issue, right? Because embassies are a way for us to protect US interests abroad. So our ideals are kind of philosophical goals, but there is an actual military-ish kind of security issue that we need to address when we're looking at embassies. And that's kind of how they've been more clearly represented in the media lately. So the Secretary of State is in charge of protecting these embassies. They need to protect not only the people, but also the facilities. So those buildings are important to kind of keep secure. And that includes embassies in the capital, consulates, those smaller branch offices, and then even smaller versions of those offices that are called missions. Usually they have regional security officers that they kind of coordinate with local police, and they work together to protect these buildings. The diplomats work for the Foreign Service, so they're not directly working for like a branch of the military, right? This is the Foreign Service that's facilitating this. Worldwide, there's actually 800 embassies, consulates, and missions, and about 250 offices. Offices. So Mike Pompeo is our Secretary of State right now, so this is the guy that's kind of coordinating how our embassies are protected. And then I know that this is a really big map, so I recommend you look at it on your own computer in a bit, but this is literally a map of all of the embassies that we've got abroad, so just the US. And to kind of zoom in and make it a little clearer, so every square on this map is an embassy, and every circle is a consulate. So there's a lot. There's more than one in every country, mostly. And but pretty much every country that we have some sort of relationship with has one. So I can't really even see one that doesn't have at least something in it right now. The numbers in red are just the time zones, so those aren't meaning anything significant. Yeah, but if you want to look at that more on your own afterwards, these slides are already up, so you can definitely like explore it a little bit. But essentially, it just means that you have a lot of buildings that you need to keep secure and a lot of people you need to protect in a lot of different countries, right? And not all of these countries are incredibly peaceful, right? Some of these are actually having a lot of, conflict and issues. And that means that you have to consider that when you're trying to protect those buildings. Okay, so let's look at institutions and some of the bills that kind of created this program, right? So the Foreign Service Act of 1946 was kind of the first thing that really restructured how this system worked. Savannah is asking, do we have more embassies around the world than there are in the US from other nations? I don't know. We'd have to Google that one. I'm not sure. I know we have like Embassy Row. So DC just has a ton of embassies. I'm not exactly sure if those numbers match up exactly though. I don't know. I'm imagining that maybe the number of embassies is the same, but probably like the number of consulates or missions is different. I bet we have more consulates, abroad than there are embassies in the US, because I'm sure that we have our little, regional command centers if we've got a lot of US people, expats living abroad, right? Okay, so essentially what this Foreign Service Act did was it authorized Marines to serve under the chief of mission, which is another term for the ambassador. They're the chief of the mission in that country. So the security of each of those embassies is provided by these Marines that have been trained by the Foreign Service, and they answer to the ambassador. This was a really big change from how these embassies and their security kind of worked in before. Before this act was passed, this is even from the State Department's description, they worked on an ad hoc basis, which just kind of means that like after they built the embassy, they would see what happened and they might add some extra security afterwards, which is what ad hoc means. So it was a lot more piecemeal, more of a responsive kind of strategy, not like a preemptive or preventative strategy. So they really changed it dramatically by creating this kind of special branch of Marines that trained under the Foreign Service to protect these embassies. Yeah, so then the 1948 joint memorandum essentially like formalized this relationship and actually is what pushed the Marines to be trained by the Foreign Service. So they would have more of that training needed to work in an embassy versus like a military base, right? Because they're trying to accomplish different goals and they work in a different way. So you're going to want to have protection that understands what those differences are and is more prepared to work in a embassy type environment versus a military base. Okay, oh, I wanted to make it visual and I forgot. Okay, so there's three core components to what the security in these embassies is trying to do, right? If you ask the Marines that work there, there's three things they want to make sure happens. They want to ensure documentary and physical security, and that means that classified documents that are in that embassy stay classified, right? You don't want documents to get leaked. And they also want to protect those buildings, right? So they want to protect the physical safety of the building, but they also want to make sure that no private information is getting out. They want to ensure personal security or personnel security. So they actually, investigate people that are applying to work in the embassy beforehand. The ambassador and the Marines that work under them, they're all, U.S. citizens, but a lot of the times the other extra staff that are present in that embassy, anyone who, keeps the building running, maybe like secretaries or other minor positions in that building are actually people from the country that the embassy is in. So not all of the staff in that building are going to be U.S. citizens. And then finally, you want to ensure security of overseas posts. So essentially, they want to make sure that the embassy stays as safe as possible, but that can be making sure that the staff that work there are legit and are, not going to betray the U.S. And they also want to make sure that no information gets leaked that's not supposed to be out there. Which sounds a lot, kind of like what we've talked about in other weeks. You want to keep private information private, and you also want to keep U.S. citizens protected. Yes, okay. Just want to make sure I missed any questions. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of how embassies work and how they're what they're supposed to be protecting. Let's look at how they've actually worked over time, like historically, and see how that goal is kind of worked out, right? Before I go into this, do you guys have any questions about those kind of like basic institutional components of embassies? Okay. All right, so one of the first big issues, and this happened right after kind of that Foreign Service Act came in, when the UN created Israel in the end of 1947, beginning of 1948, there was an existing US consulate in Jerusalem. So there was a lot of unrest in that area at the time when those kinds of lines were being drawn between those two states. And that led to, hold on one second, Badri is asking, do we own the buildings of these embassies or do we only rent them? Because two of the largest embassies I've seen are in Khartoum and Iraq. Technically that's US property, so I think the US, we own those buildings, yeah. We pay to build them, we want them to be pretty. I'm pretty sure those countries own those buildings, yes. Okay, so unrest in Israel as it's being formed, the new divisions in that area create a lot of uncertainty and anger with citizens. There was an existing US consulate in Jerusalem. It ends up getting bombed in October 47. The consul general, Thomas Wasson, was murdered by a sniper in May of 1948. So this is just a lot of attacks happening on this embassy over time. A consulate officer was kidnapped in August of 48, and a UN mediator who was essentially a Swedish diplomat was assassinated in September. There's a lot of attacks happening on the US consulate because it's being viewed as a representative of the United States that exists within the Israel-Palestine area, right? So people are directing the anger that they have at this political issue to the ambassador and the other officers who work with them, which is what you can see through these bombings and snipings and kidnappings, a bunch of other things. Yeah, essentially what I'm showing you guys is just that this is actually something that we can consider a pretty good national security issue, because securing these has been difficult over time. If we look at the Korean War, there was a US embassy in Seoul, so in South Korea, when the invasion began on Sunday, June 25th, 1950. And if you guys have ever studied the Korean War, you know that that kind of dividing line between North and South really moved a lot over the course of that conflict, right? And maybe started at the middle, but then it almost, like the North got really far south and then they pushed back, and it moved a lot. So that embassy was actually in a pretty risky area for a lot of that time. So if the invasion began on June 25th, 20 Marine security guards, so those Foreign Service trained security guards, evacuated hundreds of family members and personnel to Japan within 24 hours, right? They got that embassy as empty as they could get it within a day. And then within 3 days, embassy forces burned records, and they evacuated the remaining personnel and then flew those individuals out while actually taking fire from combatants, right? So what were they trying to do by burning records, do you think? What part of that three-pronged system were they addressing? What did you guys think? Because obviously they're securing personnel, but the protection of classified documents, yeah, exactly. They were trying to make sure that any private or secure information that existed in that embassy did not get into the hands of enemies, right? So they were also, and you're also right with saying personal, because they were getting the family members and the other staff out. But yes, also documentary security. They wanted to make sure that private information stayed private. Okay. All right, so I'm kind of taking this chronologically. So right after the Foreign Service Act, we saw the issues with the Jerusalem embassy, and then about 3 years later, we saw attacks in Korea. And then once we hit the 50s, we're in the McCarthy era, right? Which has always been a very clear, not controversial part in U.S. history. So if you're not familiar, the McCarthy era was a time when the U.S. government was trying to identify and remove any potential communist spies and sympathizers, right? There was a big fear that communists had infiltrated the government already. Joseph McCarthy, the senator that this era is kind of known for, he said that he had a list of every person in the government who, had ties to communism or sympathized with it, and he was gonna, bring them up and point them out, take them down, or whatever. Essentially, what this tried to do was purge everyone who had these ties from the government, right? And this included the State Department, which was that whole system of embassies. What this kind of push did was change how people perceive the State Department, essentially, and Foreign Service, and how the Foreign Service needs its people to behave as well. So first off, it actually increased the requirements to join the Foreign Service. This kind of era created a push for college degrees, essentially, for special agents and for investigators, so that you have to have at least this level of education to do what you need to do in this office. From a more perhaps negative standpoint, there was a lot of negative perception towards between the government and the Foreign Service, and kind of how other people view the Foreign Service as well. It removed any idea that there was independence in the Foreign Service. So a lot of ambassadors at the time felt that they could have a bit of freedom in how they worked, that their job, even if they were appointed by the president, their job was to create a really positive culture between the US and whatever country they were stationed in. They wanted to make that relationship stronger. They wanted to make US citizens more aware of the country they were in, but also make their country, more, have a better viewing of the United States. And sometimes that meant that they would, not get constant approval about what they were doing, or that they had a little bit more freedom to decide how that goal was going to be accomplished within their embassy. So they previously had felt that they had this freedom, but once they started getting, questioned and checked, and people were getting fired by the government because of these proposed communist ties, that kind of view of independence faded, right? And a lot of this really kind of still is felt nowadays, where there's a perception that the ambassador can't stray too far from the current US, political leanings, because who knows, when this threat really left a lasting impression on how these ambassadors comport themselves. And then finally, most of the people, and when I say most, it's like 90% of the people that were dismissed from the State Department weren't actually dismissed because they were communist. They were dismissed because they were gay. And that was listed as kind of like a dangerous political stance to have at the time. And that if you were gay, then I don't know, that means you were communist. I don't know. But so really negative perception of that. And then the other people who were gay that were let out from the Foreign Service were just single moms, unwed mothers. That was considered another dangerous political stance to have taken at the time. So it really hurt kind of the pool of people that the Foreign Service could employ. It hurt the perception of the Foreign Service, and it really damaged the relationship between the Foreign Service and the government. Amna is asking, did anybody try to protest or demonstrate against these acts by the department? The department itself wasn't the one who was firing these people. It was Congress, essentially. McCarthy had a congressional committee that was doing these checks and bringing these people in and deciding if they could continue to work for the government or not. If you're interested in looking at that era of history, there is a lot of, negative protest kind of movements, or at least ways that people tried to protest against these kinds of decisions, but it was just a lot of fear mongering in the country at that time. And you can kind of see, even in the State Department, that you say communism, but maybe people are meaning different things, when they're talking about who should or should not be working for the government. But it's a rough time in history, but we need to understand what happened so we can know kind of how the existing relationship between these two departments works, right? Okay, so not supporting the McCarthy era stuff, but one of the biggest things that created a big change in how security was perceived in embassies was, this is literally called The Thing, right? So they have this big wooden seal that the two of them are holding. They've split it in half, and inside he's holding a little round ball thing, and they literally called it The Thing because they didn't know what it was. What this ends up being is a listening device that was placed inside a wooden seal, like a carving of a seal, that had been given to the Russian or the ambassador in the USSR by some Soviet school children, I think 3 years ago before this happens. And what it shows is that the USSR was actually bugging the embassies that were behind the Iron Curtain or in the Soviet Union. So we saw initially that most of the issues that the embassies had were really just, they were literally getting attacked, like because of conflicts that were happening within states, right? But once the Cold War starts up, those conflicts aren't happening within these states anymore. Instead, embassies have to deal with the fact that they might be getting spied on within their departments. So instead of it being the physical security or the security of the staff that the embassy needs to ensure, now it's actually that personnel security, right? You need to vet the people that work in your buildings, and you need to make sure that the buildings are not being spied on. Brian is asking, I'm assuming they've changed those rules now and that homosexuals and single mothers can now serve without concern. Yes. Yeah. This was big McCarthy era things. It's not that way anymore. And even if they wanted to join the Marines, there's nothing saying that either of those two groups can't be in the Marines anymore. That changed. Almost don't ask until repealed. 09, I think, was the last time when any sort of restrictions like that were put in. Marines are the only tricky one though, because they're considered like frontline combatants most of the time, so it's harder for women to actually join them. And I think that's still fairly new, like in the last few years, where women have been allowed to go into parts of the military or branches of the military that are considered like directly in combat. Yeah, that one's a little iffy. I think it's opening up now, and that literally is within the last like 3 or 4 years. That one's very recent. Yeah, there's just an old school, you know, like classic view that women shouldn't be in combat. So they can join the military, but putting them in combat is still a view for some, you know, these old-timey senators. Okay. So we've got shifts. Let's look at Vietnam, another super clean and easy to understand conflict. In 1965, in March, a car bomb explodes outside the US Embassy, killing 22 and essentially demolishing the embassy, right? It's a mix of Vietnamese citizens and I think a couple Americans are in that. And then in January of 69, on the Lunar New Year, which is commonly, this is referred to as the Tet Offensive, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launch an attack in Vietnam, right? They move into Saigon. They launch a pre-dawn attack on the US Embassy within Saigon. They blow a hole in the embassy wall. They engage in a firefight. So that starts very early in the morning. Pre-dawn, yeah. So the Marines that are stationed within the embassy have to try and fight off these forces that are coming in. 5 Americans ended up being killed, and by daybreak, all of the Viet Cong were defeated. I think 20 entered, 19 died, and then 1 was kind of like captured. But what happens is that the U.S. populace, it really reduces the support of U.S. citizens for this war because the American embassy is being attacked at this point, right? That's always not something that people take too kindly. These embassies are diplomatic missions, right? They're not the military. They're always viewed as something kind of separate. So when military personnel attack these buildings, it's viewed as like a really strong signal that these aren't good people, that this conflict is going too far maybe, that the anger is getting really high. So people really take attacks on the embassy as a really strong signal. Peter is saying women have been accepted in the Army for decades now, but women were finally accepted into combat Army jobs circa 2015. Yeah, exactly right. So they could enter various branches of the military, but having them participate in armed combat was not something that was accepted till very recently. And I think the Marines have the lowest percentage of women, partly for that reason, that most of the Marine positions are considered combat, so women can't enter them, but also that there's a lot of other stuff that make women not want to join the Marines. But yes, you're right. Okay, so we're seeing a shift where instead of like, it's kind of looping back around to attacking the embassy because you're angry at the United States, right? But now that we have these norms about how embassies are supposed to be treated and kind of that they're symbols and that these conflicts aren't with the US sometimes, these attacks are sending really strong signals back to the United States. Yeah, what you start seeing, they call it urban guerrilla warfare. Some of the readings that exist on this call it terrorism, but because embassies are actually parts of the government, they are political offices, they don't fit our definition of terrorism, right? Because attacking an embassy is actually attacking a political actor for a government. So it's not necessarily that they're attacking civilians. the car bombing in front of the Vietnam embassy could be called a terrorist attack because you're not 100% sure if they were trying to attack citizens civilians outside of the embassy or the embassy itself. So that one's a little iffy, but I wouldn't call this kind of new shift and how embassies are put at risk as terrorism, because these are political actors. They can be attacked to send a political message because they themselves are political entities. So it's more of this urban guerrilla warfare, right? You're not in a jungle anymore. You're not hiding in trees to get the element of surprise. It's the shift from, even though it's a shift to putting these kind of guerrilla tactics in the urban environment, because embassies are usually in state capitals, and using them to kind of send a really strong political message. So again, the Vietnam protests, we saw the car bombs, right? There were also rock throwings, riots, dynamite was used, right? So that's the beginning of it. Some more in 67, there's the 6-Day War in the Middle East. You have 22 embassies and consulates for the United States that end up getting attacked. In 68, in Guatemala, Ambassador John Mine was assassinated. In 69, in Brazil, Ambassador Elbert was kidnapped because he didn't want to participate in some weird kidnapping scheme. In Beirut in 72, ambassadors actually hid in a parked car, and then they drill holes in the outside body of the car so they could fit their guns through. And then they fired rocket-propelled grenades at the embassy. So what you're seeing is forces that are upset at the United States using the embassy as a target because it's a political representation of the country, but then using other conflicts that are outside of the area they're in, or using the embassy as a way to convey their political message by attacking something that we generally don't feel is like a military actor, right? It's still an embassy. It's not necessarily a military base. It isn't a military base. So it's viewed as a much stronger, aggressive signal, right? These aren't people that are trying to attack you. Why are you attacking them? Yeah. Any questions about these shifts? So we had, the beginning of this kind of idea that you need to protect embassies and how the embassies sometimes got embroiled in local conflicts. You had the Cold War, where the Soviets were literally just bugging embassies to get information. And then this third kind of era where you had urban guerrilla warfare, where to convey their political message, people would attack an embassy using guerrilla tactics, obviously, right? With assassinations and random car bombs and stuff to convey their political message, because it's viewed as worse if you're attacking an embassy instead of another military combatant, right? Okay. Gosh, this movie came out a while ago, so I'm not sure if you guys have ever seen the movie Munich, but this is kind of the first event where, at least in more modern times, like before all of our wars, where people realized that these kinds of attacks that are, that's a typo in there, that are directed at non-military people need to be prepared for. And this is just, I'm including it in our talk here because it's a part of what the Foreign Service Department is supposed to be doing and kind of those Marines trained under them. So this event isn't directly connected to an embassy, but it is connected to the military part that we're talking about today. So I'm going to put it in because I think it does signify kind of a shift in what the military forces with the Foreign Service needed to be preparing for in time. So in 1972, Munich was hosting the Olympics, right? Yes. Yeah. So this was after East Germany hosted the Olympics, right, in Berlin, and everyone viewed that, it's like, oh gosh, these are East Germany hosted, and it's all these communists, and it's really rough, and there was a lot of political messages that were tied to it. So in 72, Munich is hosting it, and that's a chance for West Germany to present itself to the world and kind of show a different political message than what was seen in East Germany. So this was viewed as a really important way for non-communist powers to present themselves to the world and show their own kind of strength. But what happens is a group called Black September kidnaps and kills 11 Israeli athletes and a German police officer during the course of these Olympics. What they end up, they scale a wall of a building to climb over the fence into the Olympic Village, and they take the Israeli athletes hostage. What they were doing was protesting, trying to remember, I believe, some attacks that had been happening in Palestine. So they were upset at Israel. So they kidnapped these athletes. They wanted, safe passage, the return of some Palestinian prisoners, and then they would let the athletes go. The whole thing kind of gets botched. People didn't plan very well. There wasn't a really clear understanding of who should be responding to this issue, right? Because you're in Germany. Obviously, a German police officer got involved, but you're in Germany, but it's the Olympics. So should the German police be controlling this, or should other people be doing it? Like, does Israel need to send people up to do this, right? It doesn't really have a clear kind of jurisdictional understanding. It all gets botched at the end. The terrorists are able to kill all of their hostages. What this does do is really push the Foreign Service and the Olympic Committee to recognize that these kind of attacks can happen during the Olympics. So the Foreign Service Department created its own kind of committee to address terrorism. Okay, sorry, I thought I had a new comment. It's not a new comment. Essentially, the State Department is actually assigned responsibility to prevent these kinds of attacks from happening in the future. So that same department that's responsible for ensuring the security of the embassies is also now in charge of securing our Olympic athletes when they go abroad. So starting in 1976, special agents are provided by the Foreign Service Department to protect Olympic athletes when they're in other countries. So even though this isn't specifically an embassy, the Olympics kind of acts the same way that an embassy does. It's creating outreach between the US and other countries. It's designed to, positively influence the relationship and the culture sharing between different groups. So it is understandable why the State Department would probably be the one best qualified to provide that kind of security, because they understand what the goals of that organization are. Just American athletes, yes. I'm sure that other countries are protecting their own athletes in their own way, but it's not left up to just, the host country for the Olympics to provide all of that protection. Yes, I think it's just US athletes. Yes, yeah, just for US athletes. Yeah, and then I'm not going to say his name or anything, but that's one of the attackers with the stocking on his head because he's a dork. Yeah. Okay. But if you want, there's a very dramatic Oscar Beatty movie called Munich that shows that exact event, because of course. Okay, so here's a bit more of a timeline to kind of clarify these big shifts that we're seeing and how embassies are viewed, right? 1952, a listening bug is found in the embassy seal of the US Embassy in the USSR. That's that wooden seal that was broken apart. They literally called it the Thing, which I think is hilarious. They end up looking at a bunch of other embassies, and what they end up finding is that over 100 listening devices have been planted in different embassies in a variety of countries behind the Iron Curtain. I see a comment. Cody is saying, if terrorists backed by a state attack an embassy, is that technically a declaration of war? Well, actually, that'll fit more into one of the more recent events that we'll talk about in a minute. It depends. If they're terrorists, then that's a non-state actor, right? That's a transnational group. So it wouldn't be a specific country declaring war, but we would have to get permission to reciprocate an attack based on what country they're in, right? So we would have to ask permission if we wanted to do that. But saying that we're, unhappy at terrorists would not be something we need to declare war for. They're not a country. Yeah, if the military of a specific state attacked an embassy, for sure, that would be an act of war. You'll see it in the news sometimes. It hasn't happened recently because, of course, the world is doing other things. But there has been a lot of a kerfuffle between the US government and a lot of the security given to, I think it's the Turkish embassy in DC, because they are saying that they're protecting their people, but they are really aggressive with US citizens that they think are, encroaching on their embassy or whatever. And people have said that, isn't that bad that you've got Turkish security for the embassy attacking US citizens? And there is a bit of a debate, on, is that Turkey declaring war on the US because they're attacking US citizens, but if they're just protecting their embassy, then that's their territory. So it's still a little bit fuzzy. Specifically for terrorists, like you're asking, no, that would not be an act of war because they are not a country. But there are minor instances like you're asking about where people do want to debate that answer because it isn't very clear. Okay, so they find over 100 listening devices in various embassies. One of them was literally in the deputy chief of security. I think, I'm not going to be able to remember the exact country that he was he was the chief of security for which embassy. But he literally had a listening device in his shoe where his shoe had broken and he went to go get it fixed. And they busted open the heel and they put a listening device in there and then they sealed it back up and then he wore shoes in the embassy. So there's a lot of new security measures that had to be put into these buildings to ensure that listening devices couldn't work, that those short range things would be able to send signals out. Yes, no, Hannah is correct. Part of that kind of a debate, going back on Cody's comment, is because Turkey is responsible for securing their own embassy. Yes. Yeah, that's why there is this debate. So people can get upset, and we have these debates, but there hasn't really been a cohesive answer because at the end of the day, they're essentially protecting Turkey, right? If Turkish officials are protecting their embassy, is Turkish officials protecting Turkey from US people who think they're threatening their security. Okay. In 1986, you see the Omnibus Diplomatic Security and Anti-Terrorism Act, another fun, new, really long act thing, essentially which just creates a formal structure for diplomatic security. So it used to be called like FY, and now it's called FS, the Foreign Security Service. So that just changes happen, it gets more formalized. It starts recognizing that those kinds of terrorist attacks can happen around the embassies, right? In 1998, you see a big bump up in these embassy attacks. There are bombings in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam. In 2001, right, big change in how the U.S. views its security. We say that embassies need to be more protected, especially because the areas that they're in are becoming more unstable, right? You want to make sure that all of our embassies in the Middle East are able to do what they need to do, but also that they're secure from attacks. What we're seeing is that this is a reasonable fear to have, that they needed to actually make sure that the security was bumped up. After this act was created, or after this change happened, from 2002 to now, 90 law enforcement officers have lost their lives trying to protect U.S. embassies. So it's not that these embassies don't get attacked anymore, right? There has been a bump up in how they are attacked because the regions that they're in have become more unstable. And then finally, in 2012, this is after Benghazi, they create what the Department of State calls a high threat program to kind of better assess when an embassy becomes at risk. So I'm going to talk about these events now, because once I mentioned Benghazi, I need to talk about Benghazi. So the things that we've seen most recently in our political news, right, is Benghazi, that attack, and then at the beginning of this year, the Iraq embassy getting attacked, right, and how that connects to the US and the conflict with Iran. So I'm going to explain both of those, and then we will be done. Because what I wanted to do was kind of show you historically how embassies have been threatened, how we've responded to that, and then now we can look at modern day, how they've been threatened and how we've been responding to that. Audrey is asking, do our ambassadors communicate with the president or the secretary of state in the host country when it has to do with forging relations? I don't know. I think it's up to them, right? There is still a bit of independence in how they can go about their jobs. So whichever one they have connections with would be my guess, because not every country is structured the same way that we are, for sure. But also, their goal is just to create that positive relationship between the two countries. So whichever way works best for them, which is kind of why there always has been this perception of independence for ambassadors. Not every country works the same. No one has the exact same relationship with the US, right? So there's a lot of variation in how ambassadors can do their jobs. So there was a lot of freedom given to them to properly accomplish their goals because of that increased variation. Yeah, but good question. Yeah. Okay, so while I'm telling the story, here's a map of the consulate in Benghazi. This little wider building is the consulate, and then you've got a rear gate on the back, front gate over here. The only thing that's not pictured on this is the CIA annex that I'm going to be talking about. Just assume that it's a bit further out. Okay, so if you guys were, gosh, when was this, 2012? So you guys might have been pretty young when this happened, so I'm going to walk through the story. In 2012, on September 11, a bunch of protests started in many different Middle East countries. Theoretically attributed to this really stupid video that got posted and went crazy viral. That was like really anti-Muslim, super racist, just not a good video. Prompted a lot of anti-US sentiment and a lot of anger in the region. So protests converged around the United States, which was kind of given responsibility for this video being created. The US mission, which is this building right here, the consulate, right? In Libya, it was surrounded, and protesters ended up actually really easily scaling these front gates and then getting into the consulate area, right? So looks like they burned some cars in the front. They ended up setting fire to the consulate building. The security, so our Marines from the Foreign Service, attempted to evacuate all the personnel from that building. They tried to find the ambassador. They got separated in the smoke, so one officer stayed with the ambassador. The other personnel and the rest of the officers went a different way. No one could really see each other in the smoke. Most of the people got out. Some went back to go try and find the ambassador, and the officer could not find them, had to leave because the smoke was getting too bad. That's Officer Smith and the ambassador, yeah. So CIA forces arrived. There was a CIA annex close by. They come in, they try and find the ambassador and the officer again. They cannot find him. And eventually continue the rest of the evacuation, get everyone out, but they're not able to get the ambassador. After retreating to the CIA annex, the annex itself was also attacked. That's when like heavy artillery starts hitting it a bit. So this protest had started in the evening. By I think it's 6 in the morning, Libyan forces come in to support the fight. The CIA personnel defending the annex. They're able to hold the protesters off, and it all comes down. But I think it's 4 US citizens end up dying over the course of this evening, including the ambassador. Paige asks, was the US government in charge of putting out this video or just US citizens? It was definitely not the US government, for sure, not the US government. I don't know who specifically put out the video. There's a lot of really stupid conspiracy theories and debates around it, so I don't look too far into it. Even saying that the video is the start of the protest is debated among people. So this is largely accepted as the correct timeline, but there's a lot of uncertainty on that. I think it's pretty reasonable to think that I think it was just in English and it looked like it had, okay, so Hannah's saying that someone in California did it. Sure. I mean, I just remember getting buried under like 1,000 conspiracy theories when people were trying to figure out where this video came from. So if that is what we've settled on, cool, but definitely not, it wasn't like an official state video at all. It was some individual person, and I just don't feel comfortable like saying what the political motivations were of individual people that posted something on YouTube, you know? Okay, yeah, so that's kind of what you've learned in McMullen's class. Cool. I will take that. I'm sure he probably has a better idea of this event than I do. I just, yeah, I feel uncomfortable trying to explain what they were trying to do when they post a YouTube video, you know? It's so much of that is fuzzy, and who knows who they're trying to send it to or what they were trying to say. Obviously, this is what happened because of it, but I don't think it warrants any more, you know, I'm not going to give it any more airtime than that because it's a stupid video and it doesn't need to get shown around anymore. You know, it's the same way I treat people that do mass shootings and stuff. It's like, they did that to get attention. I'm not going to give them the attention, but that's my personal stuff. This is just generally the timeline that gets accepted. Lots of other political things happen after this. People debate, you know, I want to make sure. Okay. There's a lot of debate, you know, on why were they able to get into the embassy so quickly? Were they prepared? It's widely accepted that the embassy just was not prepared enough for these kinds of threats. Why are they able to, you know, scale the gates so easily? How did they lose track of people? Because they have shown that previous embassies, you know, have very clear plans on how to get evacuations done to get them out and get them safely. It was a tragic event, and, you know, things went wrong. But what it shows is that embassies nowadays still represent the United States abroad to the countries that they reside in, and the individuals within them need to be safe and protected appropriately, you know, adequately. You need to make sure that you have the proper training for people and the right staff. Otherwise, you see things like this. Yeah. Cool. Last event, the more recent one. Any other questions about that too? The most I want you to get out of that event is, you know, how it shows that embassies are still a target politically a lot of the time, and that they can be like, even it wasn't a military issue, right? It was people being upset about a cultural thing that had happened. So if the embassy is the cultural kind of sharing point between our two countries, the embassy is what gets, you know, the brunt of the negative opinion. Okay, last one. The attacks on the US Embassy in Iraq recently. So before I can even talk about that attack, there were other things that were happening that kind of led to this situation. So a rocket strike on an Iraqi compound killed a US contractor. That's kind of where this starts. Hold on, Savannah has asked a question. What did you say were the rules on declaring war after an attack on an embassy? So for Benghazi, at least, that was not the Libyan government attacking our embassy, right? That was a group of protesters who were upset about something that they had seen. They weren't a military group. It wasn't the Libyan military. The Libyan military actually came in at the end and helped the United States. So still not an act of war. That is not, you know, nothing about what happened that was sanctioned by the Libyan government. So it's not an act of war between Libya and the United States. Yeah. And then once they enter into the compound, they're on US soil. So it's just US personnel protecting US territory. Okay, so a rocket strike on an Iraqi compound ends up killing a US contractor. So we mentioned kind of that contractors can come in and provide help to allies. They can do a lot of different things. So it's kind of like the US contractor was just deployed to this Iraqi base to help probably train or support some Iraqi military personnel. So even though it was a strike on Iraq, it kills a US contractor. The US responds by attacking a militia group, which was backed by Iran, because the US viewed that the rocket strike came from Iran, right? So they were reciprocating their attack, but they, even though the militia group was supported by Iran and the militia members were the only ones that died, those militia members, you know, they lived in Iraq, they had family in the area, and people were very upset that the militia was attacked and not Iran itself, if that's who the US was upset with. So protesters from the area surround the US embassy in Iraq, just upset that the militia members had been killed, especially because 25 of them died and only one US contractor was killed. So they felt that the attack was way too big in response, and also, you know, why were they targeted? Essentially, the two states, the United States and Iran, have been fighting like this kind of culture war in Iraq, trying to have that kind of positive portrayal, right, where the US has a good relationship with Iraq, the culture is positive between the two of them, so that Iraq will continue to work with the United States. But Iran is doing the exact same thing, and that's why different groups are backing different militias, are working with different, you know, smaller groups militarily, and that's where all of this has kind of come to a head. In response to the attacks on the U.S. embassy in Iraq, that's what those protesters were doing. The United States responds by assassinating Qasem Soleimani, right? That's the drone strike that we saw on the news in January, I think. President Trump has stated that Iraq was responsible for maintaining the security of the embassy. That's why he's upset with Iraq. He felt that they weren't doing what they needed to be doing in the region to protect the U.S. embassy. No one stormed the embassy, from what I understand. They kind of burned some cars out front. Still not good. You know, they were threatening the embassy for sure. Not, you know, blowing a hole in the wall is what I'll say. They didn't scale the gates like they did in Benghazi. More Marines have been sent to strengthen and support the embassy. More forces have been sent to support the U.S. military presence in the country. And that's kind of where it's settled to right now. So what we're seeing is now there is a strong negative perception of the United States in Iraq, right? Not only because of the killing of the militia members, but also because of the attack on Soleimani, who many viewed that could be an act of war, right? If you can't justify that he was, you know, not working for just Iran, which the president has said that there was knowledge that he was working with unsavory groups, like terrorist groups, to cause an attack on the U.S., and that's why his killing was justified. So maybe not. I know that's just the question that we've been asking over the course of the class. And then the embassy now has to kind of try and rebuild that positive relationship between the U.S. and Iraq, right? While at the same time recognizing that Iran is trying to do the exact same thing. So it's kind of a Cold War conflict, right? It's just kind of a cultural one that's happening in Iraq right now, and it's the embassies are playing a key role in that, and they're sometimes the target of those negative opinions of their respective countries when different actions happen. I don't know. What do you guys think about that, about the attacks on the U.S. embassy in Iraq? It's a little messy. There's actual military things being connected to attacks on an embassy, so it's closer to what we saw in like Vietnam, or maybe Korea. Yeah. It's closer, it's more similar to that kind of attack on an embassy than it is something like what you saw in, I don't know, how do we say it's more mild? Well, even the ones in Benghazi wasn't connected to a larger conflict, right? Benghazi was just an upset about something culturally that had happened, while this one is connected to our relationship between the U.S. and Iraq, but also the U.S. and Iran, and Iraq and Iran, and military actions that have been happening beyond just a YouTube video. Amna says, it is very messy, but having family in Iraq, I understand the context in that there was already demonstrations occurring in Iraq at the time against the government itself. Yeah, this is kind of the difficulty that's happening, is that they were already fighting to get a positive relationship built up between the two groups, and then military actions are having their own effect. And then those military actions are spurred on by demonstrations outside the embassy because of the negative military. So it just kind of feeds into itself and makes it a lot more antagonistic than it was initially. Ryan says, did we ever have an embassy in Syria? And if we did, do you know what would have happened to it? I imagine we did. I can actually go look back at this map. Once they enter into less safe areas, they usually just order people to evacuate. So I imagine that it was just evacuated once the conflict got too bad. Let's see first. Yeah, we have one in Syria. So we've got this one in Damascus. I think gray means it's not supported right now. So yeah, I think we got evacuated out. But yes, we did have one in Syria. Yeah, they just got everyone out of there is my guess. That's usually what happens. You'll see like State Department alerts saying, don't be in the region. So they did end up, I think, partially evacuating the embassies in Iraq once that conflict started a bit. But once it calmed down again, they all went back. Yeah. Any other questions that you guys have about this topic? So I'm not introducing a bunch of new concepts. I think this one actually folds pretty nicely into stuff that we've talked about before with, military bases abroad, a little bit of cybersecurity if you consider espionage that, our discussion on leakers and whistleblowers, but if it wasn't within our borders, it's like protecting sensitive information, that, battle for hearts and minds, right? That's essentially what these are. Amna says, there were already a wave of protests regarding domestic issues, which further exacerbated grievances, causing people to storm the embassy. Yeah, so it was already a rough kind of relationship between the two of them. In the case of Iraq in particular, though, you've had military conflicts feeding into cultural conflicts. So you get a really aggressive feedback loop. And luckily, it seems to have calmed down a little bit, but that's the risk that they've got to deal with there, which is different than what we saw in Libya, which was not particularly upset with the United States at the time. They weren't actively in a conflict with the US either. I mean, I know the Arab Spring had happened a few years ago, so there was like some unrest or like some changes happening, but no one was specifically mad at the US or in a conflict with the US when that happened. It was just a cultural issue. So you didn't have kind of that feedback loop of any conflict with the US making it worse. Bryant says, I remember there being a spat in Venezuela where they forced US diplomats to leave the country. Do you know what happened with that? I haven't heard news about that issue recently. My guess, if I remember correctly, because it's been a while since I heard about Venezuela in the news, that country was just getting a little unstable. There was a lot of political unrest in who the president was and who was heading the government. And my guess would be they just said pull the diplomats out because you don't want them to get stuck there if something bad happens, right? And it looked like the government wasn't going to be playing by the rules that have been established by diplomats, or they could decide to do something, bad. So when in doubt, just get them out of there. I'm sure once everything calms down in Venezuela, or if some sort of resolution happens, they'll go back. Alex says, are there any countries that don't want a U.S. embassy? Are there any that have actively refused to build an embassy? Not that I know of off the top of my head. There's even, there is a North Korean embassy in the UK, I think, in London. So a lot of the times, even if a country doesn't, isn't a strong ally, or even if the relationship between them isn't good, you'll usually have an embassy there because the embassy is the way to build up that relationship, to make it positive, right? So you want to have that outreach. So from what I know off the top of my head, there isn't anyone in particular who straight up just doesn't want one. I could see not wanting, like a ton of US consulates, but if they have, yeah, I don't think there's anyone saying no currently. Are you saying the Venezuelan government? Oh, that's what you mean, yeah. Yeah, so I'm remembering this now. So when the presidential election happened, there was a debate on who actually won the election. There was someone who was democratically elected, and then someone who said that, or someone who won the election, and then someone who said that election was rigged, or that it wasn't done fairly, and that they should have been president. And the United States supported the person who had won the election because democracy, right? That if they were democratically elected, then they should be president. And the person who didn't win the election was very upset, and they still had enough control over government to say, get out of our country then, because we don't like you. So the fact that the United States wasn't supporting the person who was currently in power upset the current government, even though they had just lost the election. And so they told the US diplomats, who were, again, the representatives of the United States in that country, right? They said, you're not supporting us, get out. Usually, like, even if, the two countries disagree, the embassy still stays. And it's really risky for any US citizens that are still living there, because then they don't have a way to reach their government directly, right? There's no way for them to talk to the United States in an embassy, because they've essentially evicted our ambassadors. But yeah, they were pretty much like threatening them vaguely, like, we'll attack your embassy then. So I believe they left, or at least they considered it. But yes, it was upset because of who the United States decided to lend their support to after the election. And it says, if a war were to ensue against a state we used to have a diplomatic relationship with, that state's embassy in Washington also be emptied. So nowadays, because the way that we run our conflict is so different, I'm not 100% sure. I think we could look that one up if you want, or maybe ask Ambassador McMullen. He might have a better idea on like what the actual, like rules are for that. Because I'm thinking it has more to do with how stable the region is, not necessarily how positive the relationship is between the two countries. So I think it would depend more on that from what I've seen and how the framework is set up, but I don't know for sure. We could definitely ask around. And yes, we are at the end of class time, Brian. So I'm going to stop the stream, but I will stay in the chat. So if you guys have any more questions, you can still ask them to me. I'll still answer, but I'm going to stop the video from streaming. So have a good rest of your summer, I guess. It was really good to have a class with you guys. Thank you so much. And I hope you have a great rest of your year, summer. Stay safe, though, please. All right, goodbye.